So what I've got here is two pieces of 15 and 20, and to make the San Mai, I'm going to be sandwiching this piece of ADC RV2 between these two pieces of 15 and 20, and then just welding it all together and drawing it out into a knife.
What I've started doing is actually using the smallest amount of welding just so I can keep the layers together in the forge. What I found is, at least with my cheap flux core welder, is that anywhere where I put some weld bead, it almost always ends up creating a cold shut. So compared to welding all the way around the billet, which I've heard keeps the oxygen out and makes the welds easier, this has actually been much better for me, at least. Now it's going in the forge, and once it's hot I start setting the welds, and you'll see I do this 4 times, and I'm actually letting it soak in the forge for a few minutes each time to get the grain boundaries to grow past each other. And these are just really short, light passes just to get the welds set. And once I'm sure the welds are set, then I can start drawing it out using the drawing dies. Now, using the drawing dies, I'm still taking really short, light passes, and that's just so that it doesn't hurt the welds in any way. And I don't really want to be distorting the pattern at this point because it's still really thick. And the way I get the pattern, like the peaks and valleys, is when I'm starting to use the press to get the thickness of the blade that I want. I can squeeze with these drawing dies where I want the peaks and valleys to be, and that's how I kind of control the pattern. And if I were to start taking bigger bites with the press at this stage, it would put the distortion in too early, and you would end up with just really large peaks and valleys that are just less controllable once the blade starts getting thin. Now the billet is at the thickness that I want to start forging the knife, and what I'll do is I'll cut off the piece that I want to start forging from, and I'm forging in the tip, and I want it to be a pretty short stubby tip right now just because the billet's still real thick, so a short stubby tip will be elongated into a long skinny one. And the problem with this is that it will create a fish mouth just because it's so tall, and if I were to make a long skinny point I could probably avoid it, but that would end up being too long in the finished knife. At this point you can see the fish mouth is getting pretty bad, and I don't really want to continue forging it out at this point. So to correct the fish mouth, what I'll be doing is cutting off one of the 2 corners and basically making one of the corners the new tip. And I think this preserves the pattern a little bit more than trying to cut it off, forge out a new tip. It also saves more steel because you'll see I'm only cutting off a very small amount of the corner, and then using the hand hammer to just straighten out the other corner centered with the rest of the billet so that it becomes the new tip. Now I'm going to start using the press to stretch out the steel to the length and thickness that I want. And this is really where I can start controlling the pattern a little bit with the presses. You also see I put in a wood block as kind of a stop, because it's really easy to go too much and you'll either thin it out too much in one spot, or if you overpress it, that will create a really high peak and valley, and it just is more even when you have that ability to stop. And while the back end of the billet is still real thick, I'm just using the press to start isolating the tang from the rest of the blade. At this point, I would basically call this the preform of the knife, because it's still really thick everywhere, but I have the blade tip tang isolated. What I'm doing with the hammer is just making sure the tip is where I want it, so that when I start drawing this out to the final thickness, it draws out in the direction I want it to. And I'm doing the same thing with the tang. I'm just making sure everything is in alignment with everything else, so that when I do the final stretching passes, it will become elongated into a pretty good shape. Here you can really see how much the shape changed just from stretching it out. And the last thing I'm doing with the hammer and anvil is just shaping it so that I can actually get the knife that I want to make.
I'll take a second and talk about what I'm doing here. You can see I didn't forge very closely to shape, which I've said before I do because I want to be able to draw on the exact shape of the knife that I want to make, and that's what I've done. Also for San Mai, it's extremely important for the pattern that the core steel, in this case the 80 CRV2, is perfectly centered between the two pieces of the cladding steel, here the 15 and 20. And what happens is when you're hammering on it this way, or you're using the press, it will mushroom out or cause the cord to wiggle, and all along the edges it just won't be straight. It'll drift to one side or wiggle. So I always leave myself enough room that I'm grinding far into it, because it stays pretty much just centered all throughout the rest of it. But if I was forging exactly the shape, again, I might not be able to get the knife I want if I'm not exactly perfect, and the core will be wiggled and it just won't look right. You'll see places where it's an uneven distance, or maybe you don't even see the core at all. You'll also see that I drew one, like the inner knife is the knife I'm going to make, and I drew like another bigger outline around that. And I did that because for San Mai, in my opinion, it's the most stressful kind of knife cladding or forge welding that you could put a knife through when it's being quenched. It's worse than Damascus or like mono steel because you got the 3 layers and they all want to do something different. You've got even thickness that maybe one wants to go left, one wants to go right. It's a lot of tension within the knife. Where Damascus, there's just so many layers. It's basically homogeneous. Mono steel, it is. But what I want to do is like the edges take the most stress during the quench. So when you quench it, they're gonna cool down first before the core does. So I don't want any of that stress to be on the finished knife. If I ground it all the way to the final knife shape that I want, there might be that residual stress on the edges that I just wouldn't want. So what I'll do is I'll cut out the bigger shape, heat treat it like that, then grind into my smaller shape. Now, the steel 80CRV2, the core, is a deep hardening steel, which means it hardens all the way through. You couldn't do this with a shallow hardening steel. What I'll do is cut off this with the angle grinder before I start profiling, and I'll just go to the belt sander and start shaping it.
While I'm grinding this knife, I'll kind of explain why San Mai is what I think the most challenging, at least for me, just because there's so many things involved with keeping the core straight, where with like Damascus that doesn't really matter as much. Forging extremely even, because forging one side more than the other will cause that layer of steel to want to warp differently in the quench, which can cause the core to crack. And that's just another thing that can happen, is you have just the 3 layers that they can all want to do something different. You also just don't have as many chances of getting the weld set like you do with Damascus. Every time you're cutting and restacking the billet, you're strengthening all the previous forge welds, where with San Mai, you're kind of just doing that once, and it has to be perfect that first time. Now the blade is fully heat treated, and I actually finished profiling the knife off camera. So what I'm doing now is I'm starting the grind, and I didn't do any pre-heat treat grinding on this one, because it's just another thing with the San Mai, is that if you don't grind both sides exactly perfect, you'll have a different amount of the cladding steel on both sides, and that can just exaggerate warps like crazy in the quench. I started grinding this by going at a steep angle, just getting the edge like real centered, and then you can see I put on the file guide, and I just started taking deeper passes, removing more material, and I just did that until I got the primary bevels ground where I want them. And for this knife, it was really thin, so to do the bulge grind, I actually didn't grind the primary bevels very much. They're very shallow, which just made it extremely difficult.
I finished grinding in the primary bevels, and what I've done is drawn on my lines for the bulge grind. It's very rough because, well, I mean, rough in that I won't actually be grinding to these lines just because it's such a shallow angle for these next bevels that they don't actually produce a sharp line to follow. But what's making this very difficult is this knife is very thin. It's 3 millimeters thick, and to do a bulge grind, it makes it hard because you need to leave the center part, this part here, thick enough that it causes the food release. And that means that I had to grind these primary bevels very shallow, which is hard to leave the scale on, because when it's a flat grind, you know, you're coming from more like a steeper angle where it's just easier to leave the scale on. This was so shallow, this ended up being very difficult, but it's going to be worth it, and especially for the food release, but also for the San Mai pattern. What's going to be cool with this one is the spine. I'm definitely going to make sure I can reveal the core steel coming from the spine also. So the peaks and valleys effect that you get on San Mai, normally only at the edge, I'll be grinding in steep enough towards the spine to hopefully reveal some of the core, and kind of just in this center area it will leave the 15 and 20. And I'll start grinding that and do some test etch to see if I'm actually getting that core.
I've been talking about the bulge grind a lot for the food release and then just there about the pattern, but it also has some other benefits, like stiffening the whole blade. Normally if I were to have a chef knife with a really skinny point, it gets really flexible towards the tip, and I'm not a chef, so I don't know if that's a super bad thing or not, but I would think that you don't want your knife to be real flimsy and flexible, and I think I've heard people talking about trying to stiffen the tip a lot, where with this bulge grind it just has so much mass in the center that it keeps the whole knife really stiff while also having a super thin, durable edge and really thin, controllable spine also. This is how I put in my touch mark. You can see I hand sanded the blade a little bit just to get it started, and I'm using this electro etcher to etch on my initials. And I don't really hand sand a lot because you'll see that it leaves a lot of like a messy finish on it. It has some oxide that bleeds out around it, so it's only sanded maybe to like 320, 400, and then I finish it off once this is done up to 600 before I start actually etching it. You'll notice that I got the blade wet before I put it in the acid, and that just helps it get a more uniform finish all over the blade. And when it comes out of the acid, it'll just look black, and that's because the ferric chloride isn't really for the color contrast. I use it more for just creating the textural difference between the layers, and because I've said before, especially with Damascus, that I like to feel the distinction between them. Here I'm hand sanding up to 2000 now that I have the etch kind of set, but this removes all the oxide, even off the core steel, the 80 CRV2. So when I'm finished hand sanding both sides and it's where I want it to be, I actually do a whole process of coffee etching to get the steel black.
While I'm doing this dry fit, I'll talk about a few things that I do for the glue up that you just never see because I don't film the glue up. It's exactly this process that I'm doing here, only everything's covered in epoxy and it's messy. But basically all the scale and the oxide that's on there, I just rough it up in like all the surfaces. I rough it up with a 36 grit belt, just so the glue has more surface area. And then it gets on the clean steel and fresh wood. And this wood is resinous, so I wipe it down with some acetone, just so everything bonds better. And you can see this one's got really nice fit up, kind of just click together. No gaps or anything, even just dry. Could even get squeezed a little more, but super solid, no shakiness. I like it.
While I'm starting to shape this handle, I'll talk about the design a little bit because this isn't actually my design. I saw it from one of Burt Fosters' knives. And Burt Foster's been really my biggest inspiration in knife making. But this design is basically just a finger well in the back of the handle. And from Burt Foster's, it seems like I've changed it a little bit. I've made the handle a little bit bigger in the back. And I try to do that kind of to make the design in my own style a little bit more, so I wasn't just directly copying. But you'll see here I'm like just getting the handle all down to the shape that I need, profiling it. Here I'm checking the that one brass pin to make sure it's not overheating. And that's something that I like about the linen micarta pins that I normally use, is that I don't have to worry about them being overheated by the belts and messing up the epoxy. Where with that one brass pin, if I were to let it overheat, the heat would travel through and it would weaken the bond of the epoxy. Here I'm grinding to the guidelines that I draw on both sides of the handle, and this allows me to make both sides perfectly symmetrical, so that when I take off the platen, and like I'm doing now using the slack belt, to round all the bevels and sharp corners, then I know that both sides are symmetrical going into that process. Now I've switched to a 1-inch scallop belt, which just helps me refine the shape a little more, and it sets me up for hand sanding, which I end up going up to 1000 grit before I buff on my carnauba wax.
So this is the finished knife, and you can see it's cutting well. I don't have the skills to really do those thin slices, but it could do them. And I haven't mentioned this about the pattern yet, but this is what I envisioned having like the San Mai look like with this kind of grind, where it's like perfect, you know, the amount of core steel that's revealed coming off the spine, which is super cool, and just the evenness of how like it detaches into like two other little pieces there, the same over here, just looks awesome. And then the thinness of the spine is just so cool. Balance is perfect. The one thing with this that I'm noticing the more that I'm like making these bulge grind knives is, of course, it just makes sense that you don't get as much of the food release back further on the blade. So, and especially for like something really, you know, wide like this, it just gives it more area to stick to the blade. So I'm using a cucumber, which I think is a pretty good test for this, because it's just so wet that if it's gonna stick, like if something's going to stick, it'll be a cucumber. And it's not acidic in any way to where it's gonna affect the patina, or I mean create a patina, affect the pattern really. But of course, like the food release is going to be the most noticeable probably in this last third of blade, especially if you're cutting something smaller, because you can see it wants to come apart, but this one's just really wet. But there you go for the like popping off effect of the bulge grind.
This will be the end of the video, so thank you for watching.